Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Maureen O'Connor from Quilters Heaven in Northbrook, Illinois, and I am the Opinionated Quilter. Today's episode, number 50, is Sewing from the Parts Department, also known as Using Your Leftovers. Before we get to my opinion, I would like to share with you an update on the Scrap Fabric Challenge. If you remember, we cut two 1.5 by 2.5 inch rectangles for each of the blocks that you are going to make. The next step is to take each of your 2.5 inch by 1.5 inch rectangles and sew them together on the short side so that when pressed, your piece should measure 4.5 by 1.5. And you can press the seams. It doesn't matter which direction because you can always flip it the other way. So get these all sewn, and then we will have all our pieces put together to make our blocks. Now, time to get to the opinion. I've talked over and over again about not using foundation paper piecing when you don't have to because of the additional amount of work and the additional amount of supplies that are used. I saw a video from Di from Sister Chicks Quilting, and she used paper not really as a foundation to sew on, but as a stabilizer. And it really makes a lot of sense. So here's an example of where using paper for something that you could do traditionally really makes a lot of sense. If we look over here at the bulletin board, I did finish my turtle, so I wanted to show you the turtle. I did use just regular stitching on my domestic machine to do the mouth. I have an eye marked. I can either do a little seed bead, or I think I'm really going to just do a French knot with some floss. So I just wanted to share with you that. And as you know, in foundation piecing, the fabric is on this side, but you sew on this side. The paper has the lines on it on this side. Now what Di did, she used for her paper a children's coloring book, and she cut those into 6.5 inch squares. So that's approximately like newsprint. I didn't have newsprint. I didn't have a children's coloring book. I decided to use regular copy paper. I wasn't going to use my good vellum for this kind of a project. So me being as cheap as I am, I wasn't going to cut the 8.5 by 11 piece of paper into a 6.5 inch square and waste 4.5 inches. I cut them into 8.5 inch squares, and I'm only wasting 2.5 inches. So the idea is to use up scraps in this. You do have to have strips cut. They can be of varying widths. And the thing that I loved that Di did is the same thing that I always say to you folks when we're doing scrap quilts, is you want a unifier and you want some sort of a color scheme, color palette, rather than throwing everything that you have in there. And Di chose turquoise, orange, and green. And she used a white in the center. And we'll put a link to her video. She shows 4 different layouts, and actually I really liked all of them. So in my example here, I did use white in the center, and this is a little wide for me. I think I might do it a little narrower next time, but I would not keep the center one the same width, because if you keep them the same width, when you line up the next one next to it, you'll want those pieces to meet. And I want to have something that nothing has to meet, because that makes much faster sewing. So I chose, as you may be able to see, pink, green, and yellow. Just because I've always liked pink and yellow together, and so I just wanted to throw in some green for some interest. And in this method, it's really not foundation paper piecing. You're not sewing on the back side of your paper. There's no lines on the back side of your paper. You're really using your paper for a stabilizer. And when you have tiny little strips like this that's only an inch wide, it really holds it together nicely. Now I have to say I didn't cut my pieces real accurately to the size of the square. So before trimming, I had way more excess than I needed. I think if I made a few more blocks, I could get a little bit more accurate and not waste as much fabric. But after all, it is scraps and you're trying to use up your fabric. So I think this is a really good way to do it. So you just take your center strip, whether it's white or gray or whatever color you choose, and lay it face up on your paper. And then you take your first strip and sew it. And then you can press it, finger press it, use a seam roller, whatever you want to do. And then take your next strip, lay it down, sew it, flip it, press it, and keep on going to one end and then come back and do the other end. It's just really easy. Now, this method you may recognize from doing placemats or table runners. It can be called flip and sew. It can be called quilt as you go. I've got an example set up here on the table of what you could do for perhaps a table runner. If you have a bunch of strips that are from the same collection or just things that a color scheme that you want for your dining room, you take a piece of fabric, lay it face down, put your piece of batting on top of that, and you take your first strip face up, and just as we did on the paper, you take your strip, sew, flip. Take your next strip, sew, flip, and keep going till you've got a table runner as long as you like it. Now it's all quilted because you've sewn through all 3 layers, and you just have to trim it to size you want and bind it. So whether you use paper for a stabilizer for a block that you're going to make into a quilt, or you use batting and backing and flip and sew, quilt as you go, this can be a great method to use scraps and things you already have to make something that you will use. So that's my opinion. Let's get to today's episode. A few weeks ago, I had a customer come in to drop off a quilt to be quilted on the long arm, and she called the quilt the parts department. And she just made me laugh. I thought that was so funny. And she admits that she thinks she heard it from another quilter. She thinks it might have been Pat Sloan, but she's not positive. But she really enjoyed making a quilt using leftovers. And so from then on, when we use pieces we have made previously for other quilts and put them into a new quilt, have been calling it sewing from the parts department. I don't know if you remember many months ago, me showing you pieces that a customer brought in that she had cut, and I don't remember if she even abandoned the project or she just had this many leftovers. But I showed you these bags of half square triangles, just all kinds of stuff. Squares, more half square triangles in different sizes, just tons of leftovers. And they're all these beautiful batiks, so you have to do something with them. So I thought to myself, what can I do with it? And this is what I came up with. And if you can believe it, this is the same pattern basically as this. These are all half square triangles, which I put together, paired them up into combos that we liked. This actually is that square right there. We trimmed them to 3 inches, And I made this quilt, and mind you, these are not diamonds. These are squares on point. And all this is the barn raising layout of a log cabin quilt. Log cabins, while it's not a straight diagonal like this, it still has a light half and a dark half. And when you lay them out in this fashion, that's barn raising. This is the same thing. Now, if you look here, this is a half square triangle. The difference is I have a solid white here, and this is pieced, but it's still a square made up of two half square triangles. This just is pieced. So this is what the purple is here. And the white around that center is just this here. And then I keep going out. Now mine are, this on this side are much skinnier, and these are much fatter, because these are 6.5 inch, well, finished 6-inch, cut 6.5 inches. And these are cut 3, finished to 2.5. So while it's the same pattern, it can look drastically different. Now, when my customer gave me these pieces to use, it was with the idea that they were going to be donation quilts. And let me tell you, this is not a quilt I would pick for a donation quilt. There are so many little points to meet. Each time, all of these, at least in my world, have to meet. And it's not the easiest sewing in the world, but the effect is just beautiful. I need to find another pattern to use all these pieces. I keep looking at blocks. You know, there's so many block books. We've talked about that before. Been looking for another pattern to use these in that I don't have as many things to meet. And I've looked at the Friendship Star. I've looked at a lot of things. But that presumes then that you have some other pieces to put with it that will go. I don't necessarily have that. This is what I've got from her. So if any of you have any brilliant ideas of blocks that I can make with half square triangles that doesn't require much else to put with it, I would love to hear them, because I want to use these, but that was too much work for a donation quilt. It just too much work. So I'd love it if you could give me some suggestions. Just as a reminder for anybody who's here new, we do drop new episodes on Monday mornings at 7 o'clock Central Time. And I hope you find value in my videos. And if you do, please like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, happy sewing.